Luther King Jr. Day. I pray that you will find some way today to reflect upon the legacy, the philosophy, and the direct action of Dr. Martin Luther King. We are scheduled for a 12 o'clock service at the West Park Baptist Church. While I approach, I thought I would spend some time bringing us to some area where we can reflect. In a few minutes, I'm going to read the appendix and the prospective programs that Dr. King suggested. In the title of his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Subtitle, Chaos or Community. It has been some 50 years since Dr. King was assassinated. And the question must be asked legitimately. Have we moved closer to chaos? And for the Martin Luther King Day celebration, we want to look and examine the programs, literally, that Dr. King suggested. If I had time, I would also call our attention to the Kerner Report, which is the result of a report in 1968 under the leadership of our president, then Lyndon B. Johnson, whose conclusions in the 1968 Kerner Report concluded that America is two Americas, one black, one white, one prosperous, one struggling, one having the benefits of an infrastructure and an economic structure that will enhance, and one that offers the unfortunate reality of poor housing, poor education, miseducation, and an economic system that does not enhance, but indeed become very expensive for the poor. It is very expensive to be poor. No one pays taxes like the poor. We find today that in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, that he literally laid out a guideline, a program, several programs, which would benefit all of America. Dr. King, in his own words, acknowledged that America is two Americas, two distinctly different Americas, and the large majority of the America that is suffering and living in poverty conditions, especially considering the percentage of the population, is African Americans or Negroes, or those who are, I like to say, persons of African Negroid descent. And we find that even today we still make up the larger population of the prison, more than 50%. We make up the larger numbers of the homeless. We make up the larger numbers of high school dropouts. Most of our inner city schools have a graduation rate of 57% or lower. And among black males, most of our urban centers have a graduation rate of about 9 males out of every 100. This has been the case for many years now, more than 30. And as I said, Dr. King was assassinated some 50 years ago. Have we moved closer to chaos or communities? Dr. King noted even during his time that there is an increasing number of urban centers that are surrounded by suburbs that represent the white ring population. And there's a central city that represents the darker, poorer population. It seems like everything has changed and nothing has changed. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? On this day, I am compelled to celebrate Dr. King's birthday. First of all, I am a Morehouse man. And I probably shouldn't say first of all because I celebrated Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday every year of my life, long before it was an official holiday. I thank God for St. Adelbert's Elementary School. I thank God for Sister Norbert, who not only made sure that we were aware of who we are as persons of African Negroid descent in an impoverished community here in Cleveland, but that we also knew the value of the words of Kwanzaa, Umoja, and Nia, and Ujima, and the like. She gave out awards. She introduced us to kente cloth. She introduced us to self-pride, self-awareness, and self-love. Thank you, Sister Norbert, and the St. Adelbert community. But when I arrived at St. Ignatius High School as a freshman, on my first opportunity to be a student at St. Ignatius High School on Martin Luther King Day, I found that we did not celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King's Day. Instead, we celebrated St. Patrick's Day. I approached my principal at that time, who then was Father Stiles, and Father Stiles said, take the day off. Do what you need to do. Start the protest. And I did. And I did not attend school on that day during my freshman year at Ignatius. And from that day forward, Ignatius acknowledged Dr. Martin Luther King Day and gave that day as a day off for its entire student body. Part of my pain this morning is that this holiday is still regarded as a black holiday. I suppose St. Patrick's Day is a white holiday, although I know that they go to great lengths to make sure that everyone feels like they are Irish on that day because of the Irish struggle and the Irish tradition and history. Well, friends, Martin Luther King Day is not just for the black nation, but Martin Luther King Day is for the entire nation. It was Dr. Joseph Lowry who made famous in my mind and in my ears and in my heart as he spoke in Cincinnati some 20 or so years ago, where he spoke to a group called BMCR, and he said, friends, everything has changed, but nothing has changed. And part of my experience as a 56-year-old man now is that the difference between me being a young boy in Cleveland, attempting to get an education and use that as a vehicle to improve the next generation and to break the cycle of poverty in my own family, it just seems like I've gotten older and racism has gotten more sophisticated. Every time we expose racism for what it is and who it is, it has a way of metamorphosizing and hiding and denying. But there is no hiding, there is no denying, and we still must answer the question, where do we go from here? Are we going to go to community or chaos? Dr. King said a lot of things about the war on Vietnam. He primarily spoke to the economic realities of war. In order to wage a war, we must spend billions. And those are billions that we could use to eliminate poverty in America. But instead, we spend billions to gain control and to reestablish poverty in communities and countries all over this world. We know that the reason why that is the case is because poverty is big business. There's no business quite as profitable as poverty. We must consider today on a day where we commemorate the life, living, and legacy of Dr. King, who dedicated his life to eliminating poverty of all forms for all people. We must remember that this is a country that ran a business. And for almost 200 years, they ran a business on the backs of persons of African descent that they stole from the shores of Africa and dared to sell their stolen profit and, in their minds, property. They dared to work those persons for some 200 years. They ran a business where they had the authority of God over those human beings whose only crime was the color of their skin. For 200 years, they were able to enrich themselves and enrich this country on the blood, sweat, tears, mothers, fathers, girls, boys, and babies, and no benefit to that population. And today, of one of those who suffered the humiliation of being treated worse than cattle, dogs, cats, and any other animal. Chattel property. No one in this country can claim that story, nor claim the overcoming tradition that we must claim and do claim. We find ourselves today commemorating the son of a son of a son of a son of a slave in America. And yet we declare freedom. Now, we must remember the writings of Dr. Frederick Douglass, who described our emancipation as the freedom to be hungry. Indeed, the freedom to be poor, even poorer than we were on the plantation in many cases. Dr. King dedicated his life to eliminating that poverty through voting rights, through education, through housing. And if you listen to when he was reaching, he made it abundantly clear that need is economic progress. As I try to move to a close to this introductory comments that I'm making, I'm going to turn our attention to the book entitled, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? And also Jesus and the Disinherited, written by Dr. Howard Thurman. I am selecting those two books because Dr. King used Jesus and the Disinherited, written by Dr. Howard Thurman, as a blueprint for the civil rights movement. He carried that book with him everywhere he went. There is a famous photograph of the contents of his briefcase, and there in that briefcase was a copy of Dr. Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited. I would suggest you Google that book. I would suggest you find that book. I found it at Barnes & Noble's this morning. Probably about my 5th copy of that book. And I suggest you read it. Jesus and the Disinherited, which I will introduce to you again momentarily. Written by the Dr. Howard Thurman, was used by Dr. King as a blueprint for the civil rights movement. And then Dr. King leaves us his own blueprint for the civil rights movement, which is the book entitled, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? We thank God for these gems, these jewels, these pearls that have been displayed, but let me say these words as I move to make this transition to this reading of the of where do we go from here. I'm going to read it in its entirety. This morning, I got dressed, put on my tie, my suit, my watch. I went to walk my dog. And the first person I met this morning was a man, a black man, who was literally carrying a bag of dog manure. Literally. He was at work on Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday commemoration, and he was literally cleaning up dog manure and carrying on his back, a huge bag of dog manure. And I could not help but say to myself, everything has changed, yet nothing changed. And he was startled for a moment. He said, "Oh yeah, of a lighter hue." And I greet him more times than not, I usually do. And I said, "Happy King Day." And he said, "What?" And I said, "Happy King Day. Today is a national holiday. It is the celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King's life and legacy, which makes it possible for us to have this cup of coffee." I said, "No worries. Happy King Day." My second encounter was at the gas station. As I pulled into the gas station, a sister, she had her mask on and a hat on, and she was handling business. She had a long line. As I went to go grab some coffee, I shouldn't say very, but an older brother. And I looked at him and I wanted to say Happy King Day, but I didn't want to seem condescending or somehow offensive. So I waited, and I went to pay, getting his lottery ticket, and I greeted him, but I did not say Happy King Day. Then there was another brother who came in who was obviously making deliveries for the what do you call it? The Pepsi products. And he stopped me and he said, I really like your coat. I really like what you have on. And I said, "Thank you, brother." And I said, "By the way, Happy King Day." And he said, "Oh yeah, Happy King Day." And then the older gentleman overheard us and he said, "That's right, God bless you. Happy Martin Luther King Day." And they went about their business. I went to pay for my gas and I said to the sister, I said, "By the way, did I greet you by saying Happy King Day?" And she said, "No, I don't think you did." I said, "Well, Happy Martin Luther King Day." And she said the same. I went and I realized that there was nothing commemorating Dr. Martin Luther King Day. Nothing. Not only that, I realized that as I did some inventory, that there wasn't even a healthy stock of books for Dr. Martin Luther King. So once again, we find ourselves in a position where this is our holiday, but not everybody's holiday. Once again, we find ourselves in a position where it's our nation, but not everyone's nation. I wonder if we will ever get to the place where there is just one America, where Dr. King said, where everyone has the right and the opportunity to earn a living wage and to live in livable conditions and to receive an education that is meaningful and that will break the cycle. As I read this appendix from, where do we go from here? Chaos or Community. I want you to give some thought and reflection to the programs and the perspectives that Dr. King puts forward and put forward over 50 years ago. And I want you to note that many of these programs have been implemented, but not in the inner city, not among those who at the time of his life and even today suffer the most. It is very interesting how we have resisted community, yet we have embraced chaos. This country just elected a dictator who, even after his defeat by more votes than any other election in the history of these United States, he still refuses to concede that he lost. That is the kind of chaos that our country has come to embrace. I want you to turn your attention to these texts. And I just want to commemorate Dr. King's birthday with a recognition that he gave us a plan. He gave us a plan. If only we would embrace the plan. Hear ye, O what thus Dr. King says. I want you to know that this is the book that Dr. King carried with him every day. There's a famous photograph of his briefcase, and in his briefcase he carried this book. This book was Dr. King's blueprint to the civil rights movement. I want you to see the simplicity of the titles of each chapter of this book. I want that this day be a day of reflection. But I want you to see that the first title of the first chapter is Fear. The second chapter, or the first chapter, is Jesus and the Disinherited, explaining who Jesus was during his time. The second chapter is Fear. The greatest fear, according to Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays, Dr. Martin Luther King's mentor, is a fear of things that never happen. Deception. That chapter speaks to the things that the weaker class must do for survival. And a lot of that has to do with deceiving the stronger class. Hate speaks to the hatred that the weaker class is sometimes consumed with as it relates to their oppressors, and the hatred that the oppressors and missionaries have as it relates to those that they are either exploiting or are supposed to help. And then there's love. the greatest power known to the universe. And we want to understand that love, hate, even deception and fear are tools that cut both ways. They are two-edged swords. They can hurt or help the oppressed, and they can hurt or help the oppressor. This is the blueprint, one of the blueprints that Dr. King used during the Civil Rights Movement. I want to suggest to you that readers are leaders. Read and see how Dr. King's mind was shaped, and it may explain why and how and what he was thinking and why we are celebrating his life and legacy today. I call your attention to this book because this was the blueprint for Dr. King. I call your attention to this book because this is the blueprint that Dr. King left for us. It is entitled, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. Purchase it, read it. It was only $16. That's less than we spend on a meal nowadays. $16 for this one, $16 for the other one. I bought that today at Barnes and Noble. I'm going to do my very level best to hang on to these copies because the copies of these books seem to get away from me. I want you to note the chapters in this book. There's Dr. King, Chaos and Community, Where Do We Go From Here? When I consider the chapters of this book, the chapters are, Where Are We? Black Power, Racism and White Backlash, The Dilemma of the Negro in America, Where We Are Going, The World House, The Great Society. And then finally, there is an appendix. See that? There is an appendix with programs and prospects. Programs and prospects. An appendix of programs and prospects suggested and recommended by Dr. King himself in his own book. I don't know if we are aware that there have been a number of programs that have been written for the uplift of our people. The Black Panthers had a program and tenets which they recommended that we follow. Dr. E.B. Du Bois wrote a book called The Philadelphia Plan, which was a recommendation of things that could have been implemented almost a century ago that would have wiped out poverty. I want you to know that even Adam Clayton Powell had some things and writings and direct action that he implemented. And I want you to know that even Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays and Nicholson wrote a book called The Negro Church, which suggested some recommendations for the Black church. There have been plan after plan after plan. Even in 1968, the Kerner Commission wrote a plan where they recognized the ills of the inner city, and they described the inner city as a boiling pot. I want you to Google these things. I want you to look these things up. I mentioned the Black Panthers. I mentioned Marcus Garvey. I've mentioned Adam Clayton Powell. I've mentioned W.E.B. Du Bois, and let us not forget Frederick Douglass. We have had some powerhouses, but you know what? Unfortunately, we keep proving the adage true. If you want to hide it from black folk, just put it in the book. If we are wondering what the plan of action is, the plan of action has been the same yesterday, today, and forever. If we have a problem in our community, we must resolve it. We must handle it. We must take care of it. And do not forget the writings of Dr. Booker or Booker T. Washington. Do not dismiss what Booker T. Washington was able to accomplish at Tuskegee Institute. Do not forget. The only thing that I can think of that is comparable to what Booker T. Washington accomplished in Tuskegee, Alabama, is Stanford University. Most people don't know that Stanford University's campus is pretty much the head of several Fortune 500 companies. And to be the provost, like our Condoleezza Rice was, of Stanford University, is to be the head CEO of the heads of several Fortune 500 companies throughout this world. And they are able to make some decisions and create some opportunities for students at Stanford like no other college that I am aware of. Dr. Booker T. Washington was able to create a manufacturing media system long before internet and the like. I want to call your attention to where do we go from here? I've showed it to you. Chaos or community, and I'm going straight to the appendix because I don't want to spend time kicking around the problem. I want to spend some time looking at and implementing the solution. And Dr. King offered us a very concise solution to many of the problems that we find in the inner cities of America and even rural America. I am literally going to read the appendix written by Dr. King himself, which is entitled Programs and Prospects. Hear ye, what thus says the Lord. The first section is entitled Education. Dr. King writes, American society has emphasized education more than European society. The purpose is to use education to make a break between the occupation of the parents and those of their children. The schools have been the historic routes of social mobility. But when Negroes and others of the underclass now ask that schools play the same function for them, many within and outside the school system answer that the schools cannot do the job. They would impose on the family the whole task of preparing and leading youngsters into educational advance. And this reluctance to engage with the great issue of our day, which is the full emancipation and equality of Negroes and the poor, comes at a time when education is more than ever the passport to decent economic positions. Whatever the pathology may exist in Negro families is far exceeded by this social pathology in the school system that refuses to accept a responsibility that no one else can bear and then scapegoats Negro families for failing to do the job. The scattered evidence suggesting that family life is important in educational progress provides only partial support for the rationalizations of educators. For the family life explains only a small portion of learning difficulties. The job of the school is to teach so well that family background is no longer an issue. Dr. King writes that the sad truth is that American schools, by and large, don't know what to teach, nor frequently how to teach. The ineffectiveness in teaching reading skills to many people, whether they are white or black, poor or rich, strongly indicts foundations and governments for not spending funds effectively to find out what different kinds of reading experiences are needed by youth with various learning styles at various points of their life. While we aim for the moon, we putter around in academic gardens without even a relief map. Dr. King writes, we have been timid in trying to improve our schools. Operation Head Start has shown that a little work before school cannot insulate children from the impact of poor teaching and poor schools. Programs that throw a little money into a school for counseling or remedial reading instruction cannot prepare youth for the educational needs of today. The task is considerable. It is not merely to bring Negroes up to higher educational levels, but to close the gap between their educational levels and those of whites. If this does not happen, as Negroes advance educationally, whites will be moving ahead of them more rapidly. Get your education. Despite the despair and regret over past educational failures, we have not seriously begun to approach the needs of Negro and poor youngsters. The data of a Carnegie-sponsored study show that the differences in educational expenditures between center cities and suburbs have widened since the late 50s. Instead of spending relatively more on the disadvantage of the big cities, we are spending less. Another tragic example of the inversion of priorities which plagues the American society. Much more money has to be spent on education of the children of the poor. The rate of increase in expenditures for the poor has to be much greater than for the well-off, and if children of the poor are to ever catch up. Dr. King continues to write, the road to effective education requires helping teachers to teach more effectively. The use of non-professional aids would reduce the class size and provide needed assistance to teachers. More direct training and aid in teaching youngsters from low-income families is needed. Parents should be involved in the schools to a much greater extent, breaking down the barriers between professionals and the communities that they serve. Education is too important today to be left to professional fads and needs. This is not to assert that professional competence is unnecessary, but that there must be a greater evidence of competence and a new and creative link between parents and schools. Hallelujah. Dr. King continues to write, schools have to be infused with a mission if they are to be successful. The mission is clear: the rapid improvement of the school performance of Negroes and other poor children. If this does not happen, America will suffer for decades to come. I think we're there. Where a missionary zeal has been demonstrated by school administrators and teachers, and where this dedication has been backed by competence, funds, and a desire to involve parents, much has been accomplished. But by and by, Dr. King writes, a large and large American educators, despite occasional rhetoric to the contrary, have not dedicated themselves to the rapid improvement of the education of the poor. Aside from finances, a major reason for the absence of dedication to the great problem of contemporary American education has been the issue of integration. Integrated education has been charged with diminishing the quality of education of whites. Recent studies by James Coleman for the U.S. Office of Education dispute this. Integrated education does not retard white students, while it does improve the performance of the Negro. Quality education for all is most likely to come through educational parks, which bring together in one place all of the students of a large area. Because of the economics of large-scale operation, the educational park will make a practical multiplicity of teaching specialists and superb facilities involving students from a wide area attracted by the superior opportunities. Such a plan will guarantee school integration even before housing is desegregated. The educational park, look at Dr. King, is likely to be the next structure for education. Funds should come from the federal government, which must move from supporting the fringes of education to supporting the basics, the teachers, and the facilities with which they work. The federal government should begin to provide building grants to local school districts of group districts so that educational parks can be constructed. Building grants go to the localities, cities, and suburbs, which locate schools so to as improve integration. The arbitrary lines of government should not serve to balkanize America into white and black school communities. Lord have mercy. You know I got to come back to that. Because this has happened in rural areas and suburbs, but it has not happened in the inner city. They read the book, but they did not implement it in the places where Dr. King asked us to do it. They implemented it in the suburbs and in rural areas, but not in the hood. The location of new school buildings affects the long-term prospects of education. Dr. King continues to write, in the short run, schools in ghettos must be improved, and they have not been improved. They built buildings, but they have not improved the culture and the curriculum of inner city schools. Authentic efforts to upgrade them must be pursued, but the drive for immediate improvements in segregated schools should not retard progress toward integration education later. New schools should be planned so as to fit into some aspect of an educational park. Even during this period, while metropolitan school districts are being made and remade by change and growth, partial integration can occur if neighborhood schools participate during the part of the school day in joint and meaningful activities. Max Wolf, the father of the educational park idea, has suggested ways of using existing buildings and temporary structures to produce some of the effects of the educational park. Allow me to say on a side note that it is clear that Dr. King was an integrationist, But part of the reason why Dr. King was an integrationist, because he knew that if white children were there, that the dollars would soon follow. But what we have found is that our children can still go to the suburban schools and those schools where the dollars are and still be isolated and still not receive the benefits that that the larger population receives almost automatically. Racism has become more sophisticated and is getting old. The United States is far from, as Dr. King writes, I continue, providing each child with as much education as he can use. Our school system still primarily functions as a system of exclusion. Lord have mercy. For the oldest generation of Negroes, the time for effective education remedies is probably already past. But there is an enormous reservoir of talent among Negroes and other poor youth. This society has developed that talent. That's true. The unrealized capacities of many of our youth are an indictment on our society's lack of concern for justice and its proclivity for wasting human resources. As with so much else in this potentially great society, injustice and waste go together and endanger stability. The next section is employment. Economic expansion cannot alone do the job of improving the employment situation of Negroes. It provides the base for improvement, but other things must be constructed upon it, especially if the tragic situation of youth is to be solved. In a booming economy, Negro youth are afflicted with unemployment as though in an economic crisis. They are the explosive outsiders of the American expansion. The insistence on educational certificates and credentials for skilled and semi-skilled jobs is keeping Negroes out of the private business sector and government employment. Negro exclusion is not the purpose of the insistence upon the credentials, but it is its inevitable consequence today. The orientation of personnel offices should be jobs first, training later. Jobs first, training later. Unfortunately, the job policy of the federal program To God be the glory for the things that he is doing right now. Amen.